I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my wrap-up for the month of April. I read 7 books in April, and the first 2 of them were for the Unicorn Readathon, which I co-hosted. So I'm going to wrap those 2 books up first. They were, in fact, the first 2 books I read in the month. They were Throne of Jade by Naomi Novik and Stardust by Neil Gaiman. I had some ebooks on my Kindle that were on my TBR as well, but I did not get to them. I only read the print books. So let's start with Throne of Jade. This is the second book in the Tamora series, which is alternate Napoleonic Wars with dragons. The first book is His Majesty's Dragon, or Tamora as it's called in the UK. The first book was incredibly formulaic, but super enjoyable because it was just such a fun formula. The second book I did not enjoy quite as much as the first book, but it was still fun. This book finds Captain Lawrence and the dragon Temeraire voyaging to China. As we learn in the first book, Temeraire is a Chinese dragon. His egg was captured from a French ship by the British, and now a Chinese delegation has arrived demanding that Temeraire return to China. Now, in a wrap-up not long ago, I remember I was talking about Marie Brennan's Lady Trent books with regards to specifically fantasy of manners and treatment of characters experiencing non-Western cultures, but from a Western perspective. And I wouldn't exactly call this series fantasy of manners. It's a little bit too military for that designation for me, but it's only natural for me to kind of compare the 2 dragon series I'm reading at the same time that do this thing. I don't necessarily object on principle to stories that do this. I wish they were balanced out by more fantasy of manners and historical fantasy stories set in non-Western cultures, told from a non-Western perspective. But specifically comparing what this does to, say, what Tropic of Serpents does, I don't think Naomi Novik does this as well and as sensitively as Marie Brennan. What we've got here is a situation where it turns out the dragons are treated much more respectfully and are actually treated like full people and citizens with, you know, normal human rights and stuff in China, whereas they are not in England and Europe, where they are bred and raised to military service exclusively. I had actually been hoping that this series as a whole was going in a direction where it was going to address that, and so I'm really happy that it did. In this book, Temeraire gets to question how he's been raised, and therefore causing Lawrence to question the Ariel Corps' treatment of dragons as well. But I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the overall arc of this series requires Temeraire to reject the Chinese and choose England and Lawrence over what he's offered in China. Otherwise, this would not be a Napoleonic Wars with Dragons series. It would be a dragons sitting in beautiful Chinese gardens writing poetry series, which, to be honest, I would read. So what you have over the course of the whole book is the English being adversarial to the Chinese, being defensive of their right to keep Temeraire, and then ultimately there is a plot device that makes it be the right solution for Lawrence and Temeraire to go back to England, even though we've seen that conditions for dragons are actually much better in China. And so the whole story is less in the spirit of genuine cultural exchange than I would have liked. I think this is in part the difference between having military protagonists, like in this series, and having, say, a protagonist in the Lady Trent series who is a scientist, and she enters into everything with, like, a notoriously open mind. The other thing that surprised me about this book is that we didn't actually spend a whole ton of time in China. At least a full half of the book, I think, was spent on the journey to China. So this wasn't the greatest thing for me ever, but it did bring to the fore the questions of what sort of rights should Temeraire as a dragon expect to have, and, you know, why is it assumed that dragons won't want those things? All of the stuff that I would hope a series would tackle that showed intelligent dragons being raised in a military context. So I gave the first book in this series 4 stars, and I gave this one 3 stars. The next book is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. This is, of course, a standalone, and it's a pretty short book. This one is incredibly popular. There is a movie. I have seen it. It was a while ago, so the details aren't clear in my mind. So I can't necessarily do any particularly strong compare and contrasts between the two. But some people have told me, since I've not particularly liked the creepiness of Neil Gaiman's writing before, that I would probably like this one because it's his more whimsical fairy tale-ish book. And they were right. This is exactly my type of book. It's maybe not the greatest of this type of book that I've ever read, but this was solidly in my reading happy zone. This starts off in an English village called Wall, so named because it borders fairy. And it's about a young fellow named Tristan Thorne, who it turns out is half fairy, who heads off on a pretty foolish quest into fairy to find a shooting star for a girl who probably doesn't like him in the first place. And it turns out that the star is actually a woman when fallen in fairy, and they have an adventure. Now, in the introduction of this edition, Neil Gaiman writes that he was inspired in writing this book by fantasy from the 1920s, sort of, as he says, before fantasy was established as a genre. The only fantasy novel I've read from the 1920s is The King of Elfland's Daughter, and I definitely see parallels of that story coming into this one. That is also about a human kingdom that borders, in that case, Elfland, and about the exchange of magic between the two. So I definitely see those influences here. Another book that I'm guessing might have influenced Gaiman is Lead in the Mist, which is a high priority fantasy classic for me to read at some point that I have not gotten to yet. But compared to that sort of writing, this is a much more simplistic, easy to read writing style. There's definitely adult content in this. This is not a book that's for younger readers. I know some of Gaiman's books are, this one is not. But it doesn't have as much of that deep, unsettling creepiness that has repelled me from Gaiman's work in the past. In terms of the actual story, it's kind of fluff. Tristan is not, you know, the greatest protagonist I've ever read. He's dense, and he's meant to be dense. He's intentionally dense. He was probably a little too dense for a little too long for me to get particularly invested in him. But regardless, I still enjoyed the book, and I gave it 4 stars. So those were what I read for the Unicorn Readathon. I read Throne of Jade, obviously, because dragons, and Stardust had an actual unicorn in it and on the cover. Stardust was also a group read for the Into the Forest group on Goodreads that I'm a member of. I will link the group down below in case you want to check it out. The next thing I finished was a book I had been reading for a while, and that is The Glasstown Game by Catherynne and Valente. This is her newest middle grade novel, which of course I had very high expectations for because the Fairyland series are some of my favorite books. But while this is also a portal fantasy, it is about the Bronte siblings as children. This is following the deaths of the 2 oldest Bronte sisters. And now Charlotte and Emily have to go back to school, which is going to be absolutely dreadfully terrible. And on the day they're set to leave, they and Branwell and Anne wind up on an adventure to a world that seems to be populated by their toys, where a version of the games that they play with their toys, the mock battles and so forth, is playing out. I have done a full review of this book, and it was in my last double review video, so I will link that for you and you can check it out. This wasn't quite as strong for me as the Fairyland books because I think it's a little more complex and a little slower. It takes a little more effort to read and then never packs quite the punch, but I still thought there was some really, really great stuff in here, and I gave it 4 stars. So if you are at all interested, please check out my review. Next is another book that I have written my review for, but I haven't filmed it yet, and that is The Tea Master and the Detective, which is a novella by Aliette de Bodard that I had a review copy of on my Kindle from NetGalley. This is a Subterranean Press novella, so They do limited print editions, and then they're also available on ebook. This is set in her Julia universe, which is a universe that she sets a lot of short fiction in, but all of the short fiction stands alone, so you can read this without reading any of the other short fiction first. This is a universe in which space is colonized by Vietnamese and Chinese cultures, and this is a gender-bent Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in space, where Watson is a sentient spaceship. The main character, her name is the Shadow's Child, and the detective is a mysterious woman named Long Chow. And so I will be doing a full review of this. You can read my review on Goodreads, so I'll link it. But watch out for my video review that should be coming sometime this week. This has some sort of dense, meaty world building if you enjoy that type of sci-fi. But ultimately, I thought it was really character-driven, so I gave this 4 stars. The next book I read was Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. I read this because the second book in this series, Windwitch, is a nominee for the BooktubeSFF Awards in the YA category. I would like to read that this month. So I will link the group for the BooktubeSFF Awards down below in case you want to check it out. This was a book that I enjoyed while I was reading it. I found it to be a page-turner, as I often find YA fantasy to be a page-turner, but it didn't make the hugest impression on me. Basically, I gather the appeal of this series is 2 times The Chosen Ones, because the 2 protagonists, Safia and Isolde, who are best friends, sort of magical best friends called Thread Sisters in this world. It seems like they're going to be sort of jointly the chosen ones. So, you know, that's a fun twist. There are 2 of them. Sort of like how Disney looked at the Disney Princess formula and said, haha, wouldn't it be great if there were 2 of them in one movie, and then we got Frozen? That's sort of what I was thinking of while reading this book. So anyways, the thing that I want to talk about here is a bit of a reaction to all of the other reviews I've seen about this book. A lot of people point out or say that the beginning of the book, the first half of the book or so, is really slow-paced. I don't think those people have the same definition of slow-paced as me, but I see why they're coming to that conclusion. For me, the reason the beginning of this book is a bit of a hurdle to get over is because too much is freaking happening at once, and you aren't given the time to absorb any of it. And to me, that's sort of the opposite of a book being too slow-paced. You start out with, like, action sequences that you need, like, generations of understanding of the history of various empires to understand, and like some knowledge of the magic system, and it's just kind of thrown at you while you've already taken off and started running, and I was like, oh my gosh, hold on. This is why I prefer actual slower beginnings to books, where the action doesn't start happening right away and you can actually get your bearings. I realize I haven't really talked about what this book is about. I almost feel like I don't need to. It's a pretty generic YA fantasy. Safia is the Truthwitch of the title, which is a rare form of magic. A lot of people in this world have magic. It's not particularly rare, but Truthwitches are rare, and she's kept it a secret that she's a Truthwitch. She is nobility, but she's kind of run off and isn't living as nobility, and it turns out her uncle has an elaborate scheme planned out that she had no idea of, and off we go. She's pretty hot-headed, and so is this prince guy we run into, and you know, sparks fly even though they're furious at each other the whole time. Isolde is a thread witch, but she might be something more than that too, it turns out. She comes from an ethnic group that there's a lot of prejudice against. There's just a whole lot going on. It's just a lot. It's a lot. I gave it 3 stars. That's all I can muster for you right now. Next, I have Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire, which was one of the group reads for the BooktubeSFF Awards last month. This is a nominee in the short fiction category. It is the prequel to Every Heart a Doorway. These are the Wayward Children novellas. This follows the characters of Jack and Jill from that book. Jack and Jill, or Jacqueline and Gillian, are twin sisters, and we know from the first book that they went to an extremely bleak portal fantasy world with, like, vampires and stuff, and that Jill was the protege of a vampire lord and that Jack was the protege of a mad scientist. Here we see how that came to be, and this is their life story from the time they are born to the time they go on this portal fantasy adventure and then when they come back. I have to say, I actually liked this better than the first book, which I was not particularly expecting, because in the first book, Every Heart a Doorway, I did not get along so well with the writing style, which was rather blunt, combined with what was, for me at least, a lot of blood and gore and some really sort of disturbing scenes. And given that this was a story in, like, the creepy portal world, I was expecting this to wrap that blood and gore and yuck up a notch. Instead, I found this was told in a much more sort of stylized narrative tone that I really, really like. Seanan McGuire does the sort of thing in this book where she uses a witty, omniscient, wise narrator voice, which she really didn't do in the first book. And that's a sort of writing that I just click with, especially when that witty, wise narrator has sharp and insightful things to say, as she does here. This is a book that's about the really dysfunctional childhoods of two girls who are born to parents who want children for all the wrong reasons. Jack and Jill's parents want children for the social prestige amongst their peers and amongst their co-workers, and not for the sake of the children themselves, and they have these very rigid ideas of what they want their perfect child to be to show off for their friends. And it's almost more insanely messed up than the creepy world with the vampires, even though it looks like, you know, charming, idyllic middle-class America. In terms of actual gruesome, blood and gore, violent content, there actually wasn't as much of it in this book as there was in the first book. Again, I'm very surprised. The one bit of this that I can think of that really was very, very violent was described in a not particularly graphic manner. And so I didn't get squeamish about it like I got with some of the dead bodies in the first book. Towards the end of this book, Seanan McGuire does drop the wise narrator voice for a bit, and I missed it. But I ended up liking this better than the first book, and I gave it 4 stars. Hooray! And then the last book I read was Alanna, the First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. This is book 1 of the Song of the Lioness Quartet, the first book in the Grand Tortall series that I never read because I missed out on this boat when I was a kid, but these were such important books for so many girls of my generation reading fantasy, and I want to figure out what that was all about. April Sarah is doing a casual year-long read-along of this series, so I will link her channel down below and the Goodreads group for the read-along. I am participating in that. I'm not going to be reading the whole Tortall series this year, but I would like to, I've decided, get through the Song of the Lioness Quartet. So this is, frankly, a pretty simplistic book at this point. The world building isn't really there, the storytelling isn't particularly complex, the plot is pretty predictable, but we follow a girl named Alanna who has a neglectful enough father that she can actually get away with switching places with her brother when they both get sent off to school, so he can go learn to be a wizard and she can go learn to become a knight. And Alanna disguises herself as a boy to go train to be a knight at the palace because she is so much better suited for that than her brother would be. We follow her early years of training as a page. She makes friends and enemies, and it's very much a sort of school story, even though it isn't really school. It's basically school. She's trying to learn and to prove herself, and all sorts of things get in the way. But she has a really strong friend group that happens to include the prince, and she pulls through. Hooray, who would have known? Alanna also has some magical powers, specifically healing magic, but she's kind of afraid to use it, and that's sort of another through line of the plot. So this was, I can't call it great literature or anything, but it was fun as heck to read. I read it in practically one sitting. I never really read books in one sitting, but this was about as close to it as it gets. I'd heard some people say that there are things in this book with regards to the treatment of gender that from today's perspective just aren't that great. Specifically, I think what those people are referring to is one scene where Alanna gets her period and she doesn't know what it is and she goes to a healing woman. And the healing woman is really insistent that of course Alanna will someday want to live life as a woman. And she also tells her that, like, you may think you don't want children now, but you will change your mind. And those are things that may actually and are probably going to be true for Alanna, but they aren't necessarily true for everyone, and they will not be true of everyone reading this book who is identifying with Alanna. So I think that's the issue there. So yeah, this is incredibly simplistic but fun as heck to read, and I gave it 3 stars. So those were the books I read in April. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you're planning to, let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you are having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.